Sure.
Ready? So, hello to everyone. I'd like to start by explaining what we mean when we call ourselves Afghans Against Extremism. When we use the term extremist, we mean two things: regional organized terrorist organizations such as the Taliban, such as Al-Qaeda, and now ISIS, which has also found its way into Afghanistan, and what we call extremist culture. For example, I'm sure many of you remember what happened to Farkhunda in Kabul, and there was also the recent story about a husband cutting off his wife's nose in Afghanistan. This is the result of what we would call extremist culture. When you have a country that has been decimated by war for decades, such as Afghanistan, then that country becomes susceptible to extremist right-wing terrorist organizations, such as the Taliban. Even worse, when these events occur in a consecutive sequence, an entire generation which was born during a time of heavy violence and radicalization falls prey to extremist culture. It is incredibly important, however, that we recognize that extremist culture is the direct result of decades of radicalization by groups which impose a specific ideology on a population. Now that our definition of extremism has been defined, the next question is obvious. What do we mean when we say we're against extremism? Specifically, how are we against extremism? And how do we combat extremism? Before we can answer this question, before we can move forward, we have to first look back at what it was that led us here. With that in mind, I'd like to begin our timeline by focusing on some of the social and democratic reforms which took place in Afghanistan all throughout the 20th century. From there, I will explain in greater detail the events in the 1960s and 1970s, which would eventually result in the country's downfall and ultimately lead to the rise of the Taliban, which by 1996 took control of most of the country, including the capital city of Kabul. At the start of the 20th century, in 1923, Aminullah Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan, secured the ratification of Afghanistan's first written constitution. Although still an Islamic state, governed by Sharia, the new constitution guaranteed that all Afghans subjects would have equal rights in accordance with the laws of the state. The constitution also guaranteed greater rights to religious and ethnic minorities such as the Hazaras, who were predominantly Shia Muslims and so were massacred and enslaved in the 19th century by Abdul Rahman Khan for both their ethnical and religious minority status. The 1923 constitution abolished slavery, torture, and forced labor. It stated that other religious minorities, such as Hindus and Jews, were also entitled to the protection of the state. Finally, elementary education for all Afghans, regardless of sex or ethnic makeup, became compulsory. But Amir Aminullah Khan didn't stop there. Going against centuries of traditions and customs, he introduced ambitious legislative reforms to improve the rights of Afghan women. He also made reforms to improve children's rights. Prior to the 1923 constitution, in 1921, he implemented a family code which banned child marriage, excessive dowries, and the exchange of women for payment of disputes. He opened up several all-girls schools and sent girls abroad for higher education. After 1923, Aminullah introduced Afghanistan's first civil code, which abolished polygamy and marriage to girls under the age of 18. His wife, Queen Soroya, was a passionate advocate for women's rights as well. She once removed her veil at a public meeting to make a political statement against oppression which provoked heavy criticism from the religious elite. She also actively participated in politics. Aminullah Khan implemented all of these reforms within just 3 short years, but unfortunately he was ahead of his time. The religious elite in Afghanistan rejected the 1923 constitution as a communist document and began a rebellion to overthrow Amir Aminullah Khan and reverse his reforms. Although the rebellion failed, it did force Aminullah to make some concessions to pacify the religious elite, such as reversing the elimination of torture, and some rights for women which had already been implemented were reversed. However, after Amir Aminullah became king in 1926, just a few years later, he immediately announced even greater social reforms for Afghan women. He agreed to further access to education for women and condemned the forced veiling of women, arguing that the decision to wear the veil was a matter of choice and should not be enforced by law. Once again, however, the religious elite rallied various conservative Afghan tribes to rebel. This time, the king received little help in suppressing the rebellion and was forced to flee Afghanistan under threat of death. Aminullah's grandfather, Abdul Rahman Khan, had once warned his son, Habibullah, Aminullah's father, that change can only come to Afghanistan slowly. It seemed that in this case he was right, and Aminullah's overambitious nature and eagerness was the cause for his failure. Aminullah's successors overturned many of his reforms, including those which improved the rights of women. They discarded the 1923 constitution and enacted their own, which is commonly referred to as Afghanistan's second constitution. It wasn't until about 1959, about 30 years later, that the mandatory veiling of women was repealed. Prior to 1963, Mohammad Dawood Khan served as Afghanistan's prime minister, while his cousin, King Zahir Shah, fulfilled the ceremonial role of king of Afghanistan. Dawood, who had more control over Afghanistan, returned some of the progressive reforms that were lost. When Dawood defended repealing the mandatory veiling of women, citing that Islam did not make the veiling and seclusion of women mandatory, the religious elite began to incite violence and even attack women with acid, until Dawood jailed about 50 of them and charged them with treason and heresy. Dawood ultimately had to step down as Prime Minister in 1963, however, due to his insistence on the creation of a Pashtunistan state, which would have absorbed territory currently held by Pakistan due to the 1893 Durand Line Agreement. This backfired on Dawood due to its unpopularity with Afghans not of Pashtun descent. Pashtuns in Pakistan also had no interest in the formation of Dawood's Pashtunistan state and were more interested in their continued isolation from both Afghanistan and Pakistan. This issue still goes on today, however, and is the primary political reason why the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is not secured and why the Afghan government has such difficulty dealing with terrorist organizations. Once Dawood resigned as Prime Minister, due to growing tension with Pakistan and internal pressures in 1963, King Zahir Shah began to take a more active role in government. In 1964, under the leadership of King Zahir Shah, yet another new constitutional monarchy was enacted after being ratified by a Loya Jirga, which was intended to bring about new democratic and social reforms. Unlike Amanullah Khan's time, however, the liberal educated elite and the tribal Khans united under Zahir Shah's leadership and supported the new constitution. With his new constitution, King Zahir Shah put limitation on his and future monarchs' power. The new constitution established a two-house parliament, free elections, freedom of the press, due process, freedom of assembly, and gave women the right to vote. It also gave women the right to participate in government, be elected to parliament, serve as ministers of government, and become government ministers. Due to these changes, in 1965, Qurban Mirzai became the first female minister to ever be elected, thanks to the support she received from women. Zahir Shah also included minorities in the political process. He appointed Dr. Muhammad Yusuf, a Tajik, as his Prime Minister, and made Abdul Sattar Sarat, an Uzbek, Deputy Prime Minister. The Constitution also placed Afghanistan's national, general, and civil criminal laws above Sharia in a move towards secular law. There was also one provision of the Constitution which prevented members of the royal family from participating in political parties and holding high levels of position in government. It seemed this was specifically added to prevent Zahir Shah's cousin, Dawood, from returning to power. But the new rights and freedoms the 1964 Constitution provided proved to be a double-edged sword. Communism had been strictly suppressed before 1963 because Dawood saw it as an internal threat which the Soviet Union could manipulate. After 1964, these groups were able to organize. In 1965, under Soviet supervision, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, otherwise known as the PDPA, was founded by Mohammad Taraki, head of the Khalq faction, and Babra Karmal, head of the Parcham faction. In the years after 1978, the formation of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan would result in the overthrow of the Afghan government and the deaths of countless Afghan civilians, my family being among them. But after their initial formation in 1965, the PDPA began to resonate with young students and intellectuals in Kabul University and the Afghan middle class. In the same year, Afghan voters elected 3 PDPA members to parliament, Babra Karmal being one of them. In 1969, Hafizullah Amin was also elected to parliament as member of both the PDPA and the Khalq faction. It was these 3 men, Muhammad Taraki, Hafizullah Amin, and Babra Karmal, that would eventually take their turn as president of Afghanistan after 3 bloody coups. At this time, however, still in 1965, the Islamists had not yet gained significant traction. Clashes between the Islamists and the supporters of the Soviet-backed PDPA and other communist parties were becoming a regular occurrence. Violent fights were beginning to break out between devout Muslims and communist students at the Kabul University. It was here that an Islamist group of professors looked to Pakistan and Saudi Arabia for help to fight against the Soviet-backed PDPA. As a result, many traditionally conservative clerics won election into parliament and spoke out against what they called the communist infiltration of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, future Mujahideen leaders such as Burhanuddin Rabbani and Rasul Sayyaf began introducing students at the Kabul University to the Muslim Brotherhood philosophy and planting the seeds for radicalization in the future. All of these factors, both internal and external, began to undermine Zahir Shah's democratic reforms. A 3-year drought from 1969 to 1972 made things significantly worse. It was in 1973 that Zahir Shah's cousin, former Prime Minister Mohammad Dawood Khan, with the help of Soviet-backed Parcham faction of the PDPA led by Babra Karmal, staged a coup while Zahir Shah was in Europe for an eye operation. After the coup was successful, Dawood abolished the monarchy and announced the creation of the republic. Many Afghans were informed by Radio Kabul later that day that not only was Dawood Afghanistan's new and first president and head of state, but that he was also Afghanistan's new Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister of Defense. In one night, Dawood ended a 226-year-old Afghan monarchy, and former King Zahir Shah was warned not to return to Afghanistan by Dawood. Now that he was back in power, Daoud, with the help of Pacham members of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, shifted his attention to the Islamists. In the same year of his coup, 1973, over 50 Islamists, including future leaders of the Mujahideen such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Ahmed Shah Massoud, Burhanuddin Rabbani, fled to Pakistan. The PDPA, both the Pacham faction, which now had cabinet position in the new government, and the Khalq faction were given strict orders to cooperate with the new government and assist Daoud, whom they saw as the perfect puppet. Daoud had other plans. After seeking more economic aid from Moscow in 1975, Daoud established his own party, the National Revolutionary Party, and made all other parties illegal. He began removing Pacham members from cabinet positions and placed many PDPA members in jail. He placed Babrak Karmal on surveillance, and by 1977, all Pachimis in Daoud's post-coup cabinet had been erased. The Soviet Union was losing influence in Afghanistan at a rapid pace. After the purge, Daoud also lowered Afghanistan's dependency on the Soviet Union, and by 1976, he lowered Soviet military advisors from 1,000 to only 200. During this time, the Pakistani Prime Minister, in fear of Daoud's claim to territory Pakistan currently held, began providing military training and arming young Islamists who fled to Pakistan from Afghanistan after Daoud's 1973 coup, in hopes of removing Daoud from power. These young fighters were told to attack provincial towns and military outposts to provoke a general uprising from the Afghan people, which would overthrow Daoud. This would lay the foundation for Pakistan's future military involvement in Afghanistan. The intention behind this move was not for the fighters to succeed, but for them to force Daoud's hand in seeking Pakistan's assistance and to improve Afghan-Pakistan relations in favor of Pakistan. To this day, the Pakistani government and military still employ this strategy, which prevents stabilization in the region. Much like it does today, this tactic worked, and in 1978, Daoud gave this speech in Pakistan, quote, "Your strength is our strength, your welfare and your stability is our stability. I hope this friendship between Pakistan and Afghanistan will be permanent and everlasting." The Pakistani government's duplicity was the least of Daoud's problems, however. The Soviet Union was not happy about Daoud arresting the members of the PDPA and called a meeting with Daoud. Talks broke down quickly, and just before leaving the meeting, Daoud told the leaders of the Soviet Union, quote, "We will never allow you to dictate to us how to run our country and whom to employ in Afghanistan. How and where we employ the foreign experts will remain the exclusive prerogative of the Afghan state. Afghanistan shall remain poor if necessary, but free in its acts and decisions." It was this quote which made the Soviet leaders realize that Daoud was no puppet, and a plan to replace him and install Mohammad Taraki, head of the PDP and Khalq faction, had already begun. At 9 a.m. on April 27, 1978, the coup began, and 2 days later, Daoud was dead, and the PDPA, under Mohammad Taraki, was now in power.
Thank you so much, Ali. Now, I'd like to introduce our second speaker on the panel, who's a writer and a poet, an award-winning artist who promotes unity and respect for the nation. Through his life, with first-hand experience of living under the extremist regime, he understands the fundamentals of extremism and what it does to an individual living under it. He expresses his views through his music by promoting unity and against extremism. He now is a global political major and hoping one day to lead the nation from these extremists and make it the beautiful country it is. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the Vice President of the
Hello everybody. Before I begin, I would like to thank you all for joining us on this evening. I'm glad to see the exec and all the general members alongside with other student associations, representative of multicultural clubs and other organizations who are present here on this evening. Afghans Against Extremism is an open group that is strongly against any extremist movements. Afghans Against Extremism is here to raise an awareness about the extreme culture that has taken away many innocent lives, especially in Afghanistan. Continuing on where Ali has covered, after Mohammad Dawood Khan's death, his government was overthrown and most of his family members have been killed. At this point, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, under the leadership of Nur Muhammad Taraki, came to power. Taraki was declared Afghanistan's new president and prime minister, as he appointed Hafizul Amin as deputy minister. Not long after, the American ambassador Adolph Dutz was assassinated. As a result, the Americans had assistance to Afghanistan, and power struggle began between Muhammad Taraki and Hafizul Amin. On September 14th, Hafizul Amin supporters confront and kill Taraki, which effectively made Hafizul Amin Afghanistan's new president just months after Taraki cop up against Dawood. On the other side, the Soviets were told by its KGB spies that Hafizul Amin's rule was a threat for Central Asia, and Hafizul Amin could not be trusted. Central Asia that was controlled by USSR, such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. The Soviets also thought that Hafizul Amin was behind the assassination of Nur Muhammad Taraki, and therefore did not trust him. At this time, on December 1979, the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan. 3 days later, Hafizul Amin was pronounced dead in one of his palaces, and Soviets appointed Babar Karmal as new president of Afghanistan. By 1980s, the Mujahideen rebels rise against Soviet invaders, and the USSR backed Afghan army. As a result of the war, in 10 years, 2.8 million Afghans fled to Pakistan, and another 1.5 million to Iran, and many more to the Central Asian neighboring countries in the region, in what was one of the largest refugee migration in recent history. I was actually one of those refugees myself. And I remember at the age of 5, when I left Afghanistan to Tajikistan, which is bordered on the northwest of Afghanistan, I personally remember how hard it was for my family to leave their loved ones behind in order to save their children and their future. They were left with no better option. Now I will get back to the dark side of the history of Afghanistan. In 1984, Saudi Islamist Osama bin Laden made his way to Afghanistan and 8 anti-Soviet fighters. At this time, the United Nations was under pressure by many countries that supported to end the war in Afghanistan after many human rights violations. By September 1988, Osama bin Laden, along with 15 other Islamist figures, formed Al-Qaeda. They created a base in Afghanistan to continue their intent to commit jihad or a holy war against Soviet troops. And many other powers and groups were against their goal of establishing a pure nation state governed by Al-Qaeda's version of Islam. At this time, the Soviet Union was losing war and proved itself unable to support the communist regime of Afghanistan. The USSR has won their first battle in Afghanistan despite losing ground in Afghanistan to the Mujahideen. The USSR blamed the United States for supporting a movement that would promote an Islamic state. By 1989, the United States, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union signed a peace accord in Geneva, where they would guarantee Afghanistan's independence and sovereignty with the withdrawal of 100,000 of Soviet troops. Where the USSR withdrew its troops, the Mujahideen pushed forward a resistance movement against Soviet-backed regime in Afghanistan. President Muhammad Najibullah, who had until 1986 served as a chief of Afghanistan's secret police, installed by Soviets as Afghanistan's new president in 1986. After the Soviets no longer felt they could trust Babar Karmal. Najib's presidential term only lasted until 1992. In the same year, the Mujahideen, along with other rebel groups, with the assistance of anti-communist troops, stormed the capital Kabul to oust Dr. Muhammad Najibullah from power. Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a legendary guerrilla and the most powerful military commander during the war, led his troops to the capital. President Najibullah was captured and his government was overthrown. Although he offered asylum by the United Nations, he refused to leave Afghanistan because he thought the Taliban would not kill him. Now, former President Najibullah was no longer an issue. The Mujahideen fractured from being warlords to government officials, where they reformed the republic into an Islamic state. Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani was chosen by